George Kopits is a global fellow with the Wilson Center's Global Europe program. He's also a member of Portugal's Public Finance Council and adjunct faculty with the Central European University. He joins us today to talk about what's next for Italy. And George, a week ago, when we were talking about this topic in anticipation of this interview, a coalition government had not yet been formed. So tell us where we are today.
Well, there is a coalition government, and it's a mongrel, you might say, because it's a combination of populists, of nationalists. The government itself has a number of technocrats, so it is really a big question where we are going. It has not been tested. The interesting thing about this coalition government is that the parties involved have not held really national office. I mean, in Rome, the populists, the Cinque Stelle, the Five Stars, had a mayor or have a mayor right now. But other than that, there is no track record in government. And what's also interesting is that they come from different camps. They've been against each other in the polls during the elections. So
former rivals and inexperienced.
Exactly, untested. Yeah. Unlike the Holland.
So is the suggestion they're not ready for prime time, or is that just the possibility? What are your thoughts on that?
They have to be ready.
Yeah,
there's no choice right now. They're on there, and they are. It's very interesting.
Game time. So they're described in the context of Italian politics as an anti-establishment party. Is that, I'm sure, applies to an EU context as well. Explain to American viewers what that means.
Well, I don't know if it really needs that much explanation for the American viewer who has been tuned into U.S. politics over the last year, 2 years.
We have an anti-establishment president in some ways.
In some ways. So the idea is to change things, to really break down the elites, to end with corruption. That is something that they have in common. Mm-hmm. You might say but it's not clear yet that it could be a deconstructionist party, namely trying to change institutions, but without really a very strong majority in parliament.
So Prime Minister Conte gave a recent speech where he described the plan and received a confidence vote from the upper house of the Senate. Tell us about what he had to say and what your initial impressions of the plan are.
Well, it has several different facets, but what is particularly interesting from the standpoint of internal Italian politics is that the electoral promises that the parties had made are being presented as sort of, let's do it gradually. Mm-hmm. We cannot do it overnight. We have in mind a flat tax, about 15%. Well, first it should be for corporate taxpayers, self-employed taxpayers, and so forth. It's picking them out, making it look, yeah, we are doing it, but it's not going to be there until 2020. And similarly with the universal basic income of 700 and some euros per person, that also is to be established gradually after there is some new institutional setup for job centers and so forth. So it seems that they're really saying, well, let's not try to do it all because it's kind of difficult, which in a way is good news. It's sensible. It's not an immediate change that they are promoting. The speech at the same time had a confrontational element towards. I'm not saying that it was confrontational, but it had that element towards mm-hmm. the European Union and the EU institutions. So you have that mix on migration, on immigration. I believe that that's where probably the most important changes will take place in the immediate future. Although interestingly enough, the previous government had already dealt with it, trying to slow down the number of immigrants with various measures, physical and and legal and so forth. So you might say, in a way, that it's continuation of that.
Will it be a wait and see attitude on the part of the EU or the markets? Will they not overreact initially and wait and see how it all plays out?
Well, there was a little overreaction, but it was not that significant in the markets. The markets are nervous, but there is a lot of anticipation, and then there is nervousness. There is no question about it. But in general, the attitude is, well, let's give them a honeymoon, whether, I don't know if it's 100 days or whatever, but soon enough, there will be situations where they have to really show their colors and how they are going to proceed.
Even with this plan of essentially trying to introduce what could be, if they were hurried, disruptive changes, but incrementally introduce them in a way where they'd be less disruptive, what elements of that plan have the potential to be the most transformative or the most disruptive?
Well, on the fiscal front, for example, because that's where they can move, it's the issues that I had mentioned to you, the tax, the universal basic income, and also, and this is a question, it was not really mentioned, I don't believe, in the speech yesterday, but certainly on and off from the pulpit, the party leaders have touched on this, is to reverse the Social Security, the pension, public pension reforms that were adopted 7 years ago by a technocratic government, and that can really create a lot of unease, or maybe even more reaction from the markets. When we say markets, by the way, I should mention to you that the markets, and of course markets are enemy, right? Markets are primarily Italian bondholders, Italian sovereign bondholders. So it's not, they can use the rhetoric, and it's used in many other countries, like in Turkey and so forth. But when it comes right down to it, you're scaring primarily by really doing these things, or you might be scaring by, institutional investors and Italian investors in bonds. So that can have really a strong boomerang effect.
In the large picture, and I'm talking a decade from now, not a year from now, we've had almost a decade of the austerity movement having the most momentum. Is this a natural pushback? Is this the way that economies work? And should we expect to move to something else, a stimulus approach versus an austerity approach? Is that a natural flow, or should the expectation be that austerity continues for the foreseeable future?
Well, interestingly enough, the answer is yes and no. This depends on societies, on cultures. Are they really willing to learn from the past or not? If
so
you
you're saying it's not a
for
technical
example,
decision. It's more of
no. There is the answer on the one hand is yes, and particularly in the case of Italy, there is a reaction to what they call austerity, namely adjustment program. Well, there wasn't a formal adjustment program, but certainly the government at the time in 2011 adopted one with some follow-up, and there is that adjustment fatigue, if you wish, which is normal, and of course politicians can take advantage of it. The other problem, in the case of Italy, is that the effects, some of the bad effects, some of the negative effects, such as high unemployment, persists, low productivity, and it's quite visible. It's not that these unemployed are all over the country, where they are very much located in the southern part of Italy. Now, let me mention another country, Sweden. Sweden, from a quadruple or triple crisis in the early 90s, after having a very generous welfare state and all that, political disagreements among 5 parties that wouldn't talk to each other until the time of the crisis, they learned their lesson. They adopted good practices in banking, in public finances, across the board. They learned that. They don't want to go back to that, and they had to bite the bullet. And the interesting thing is that the debt ratio, which was shooting the debt to GDP ratio, public debt to GDP ratio, was shooting up above 100%. And they learned their lesson. And once they persevered in these reforms, the economy turned around and started to grow. So in fact, they could grow themselves out of the debt, which is one thing that was mentioned yesterday by as in a wishful way by Premier Contes.
Well, you mentioned high unemployment and low productivity, some weaknesses of the economy. What are the strengths of the Italian economy?
Well, they still have a good manufacturing sector in the north. They are good at finances. There is a lot of talent in that country. I mean, I was there in Milan and in Rome at conferences like within the last 6 weeks, and it's pulsating in Milan. It's one of the countries that has the highest disparity in talent, in productivity, in incomes, and it's regional. So that can really be exploited a little bit better by politicians, especially if they get together, they say, well, we have a common front, which remains to be tested.
So earlier when I asked you if the new government, the new inexperienced government was ready for prime time, you expressed a sense of urgency when you said it has to be. Is that based on the fact that the size of the economy, its importance within Europe and to the global economy as a whole? Is that your sense of urgency?
Well, the sense of urgency is that the debt burden of Italy, the public debt burden, but also you might say the private, the high number of non-performing loans in the banking system, which still needs to be reformed. These are not going to go away, certainly not with rhetoric or just wishful thinking. Italy, you might say, that is really a case of Sisyphus pushing up the big rock on the hill, and in fact, it has tried to do that a number of times, and then the rock, the boulder, rolls back, because they did manage in the early days of the Euro membership of reducing their public debt, but then they let go.
So I know economists love to talk about, on the other hand, scenarios, but is there a consensus among economic experts of what is the most effective way for Italy to proceed in addressing that debt problem?
Well, of course, you might say there are economists such as the one who was vetoed by President Mattarella, Savona, who believes that, the euro is a straitjacket and Italy needs a big stimulus package and everything will be fine and dandy, But these are really outnumbered by those who really look at the numbers, look at the situation of Italy, and they have in mind successful adjustments elsewhere, and they believe that indeed the way to go forward is to take reforms which may have a short-term cost, but a long-run benefit. And I just mentioned the case of Sweden. Now, why can't Italy do that? You see, so that's a little bit the perception, and particularly in some of the northern countries, they feel that the Italians should do their own homework, and in fact, they should do it because of themselves, for their own sake. If you look at it in terms of intergenerational equity, it's one thing to focus on the present, which politicians usually do, but what about the inequity between the present generation and the future generation? A lot of time was wasted, actually, in that first decade of Euro, right? Or after Maastricht, if you wish, where because of the decline in the interest bill, which was phenomenal, actually, since the currency risk disappeared, as Italy joined and the other countries too, there was this expansionary boom, which shouldn't have taken. Those are the sunny days when you really want to repair the roof, and it was not taken advantage. So there are a lot of, and those points are not, of course, the politicians don't mention that.
Is
Yeah.
there? Is
It's
there?
inconvenient, right?
Right. That we didn't act when we should have. Not going to hear many politicians.
Right. But we are at point B.
Yeah. Is there a time frame that where things need to start trending in a positive direction before this becomes a bigger problem, or can they just muddle along for an interminable amount of time?
It's not really like that anymore. We are getting very close to that 23rd hour. Mm-hmm. And in fact, last week was a foretaste of what might happen. I should perhaps mention here the metaphor that Charles Schulz, the late Charles Schulz, who was budget director and also chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, he was looking at the U.S. debt, and this was 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. He was looking at the U.S. Deficits, actually, government deficits, at a time when the debt was less than 60% of GDP, the U.S. debt. He asked the question, well, is this really just a nice domestic pussycat, nothing to worry about, or is it a case of termites in the basement, which eventually can really destroy a house, or is it really a wolf at the door? And the question now is particularly relevant also for the U.S. and some other countries, because the debt has just ballooned, and it's going to further balloon in the case of the U.S. We are already at double of that debt ratio, mm-hmm. around there, and shooting upward. But still, it's a case of termites. You might say, well, U.S. has a reserve currency. Well, it might inflate some of this with its own currency, inflate away some of this debt. There could be some devaluation of the dollar, and eventually some steps will be taken to adjust again. Okay, so there is nothing to worry about immediately. The case of Italy is similar, except that they are stuck to a fixed exchange rate, which is the euro. They have no control over monetary policy. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the tools that they have, namely labor market liberalization, fiscal adjustment, is what they can use. Now, if they don't use that, and the markets are rather nervous about it, then those termites can easily snap into a situation of the wolf at the door. And that's where we are. It could happen actually sometime soon, or maybe it can be somehow pushed out into the future, but the danger is there, because not just a matter of Italy. Something can happen in the world, but they are vulnerable.
The domino effect, yeah.
The vulnerability, mm-hmm. of Italy cannot be underestimated at this stage.
George, a final thought on people who are going to try to track this situation. What's coming up in the near future that we should keep an eye on?
Well, the next station in this train ride, if you wish, is the EU summit, which will take place at the end of this month. And that will certainly be a very important opportunity for Conte to actually speak up, to have a confrontation, which of course will be watched in Italy, so they want a confrontation. They don't want to get rid of the euro. In fact, that's why they backed down last week with a chicken game with the president, okay, because they want the population, wants the euro, mm-hmm. okay? But there will be other type of concessions which he might try to get behind closed doors or what have you. Notice that this is really a process that in fact has happened in the case of Greece. That first it's the denial, okay? Berlusconi, 7 years ago said, hey, the restaurants are full. The planes, you can hardly get a seat on a plane, And then started, and that's recently with this, the electoral campaign, it was a blame game. Mm-hmm. Let's blame the Germans, the EU, the markets, of course. Now the next stage, okay, if we watch what happened in Greece and some other countries, is the blackmail period, okay. So this is something to watch out for. What sort of concessions? Because in a way, the EU is not advancing, you see. I mean, they have been kicking the can down the road. Mm-hmm. But then the next test will be around October in the fall with the budget. The budget bill for 2019. Because there they will have to come up with the concrete measures that they are planning to introduce gradually. So that, and they are going to be tested by the markets, and also the EU, in every EU member country, has now the prerogative of looking at a budget bill before it is implemented and give an assessment of that. So that's where we are.
George, thank you very much. Appreciate having you here and your clear explanation of a complex situation.
Thank you.
Thank you.